delighted to have Tom Ciotti here tonight with us to give his perspective on the history of Seal Cove and the Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. And Tom has been a real friend and good neighbor to the area, as many of you know, and we're delighted to have him here. So I'm going to keep this real brief. My name's Brian Novak McSweeney. I'm one of the co-chairs of the presentation committee for the History Association. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Tom, and let's have a nice hand for him.
Good evening. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great. You know who I am, because if you read the flyer, it had a little bit about that. Probably the most important thing in there is that I am a lawyer, so I'm going to start off with a disclaimer. I'm not a historian. I am really an amateur at this. You have a couple of, at least semi-pros in this audience. I see Dave Cresson is back there, founder of this organization. I'll say a little bit more about him a little bit later, but just to get started, I was wondering, how many people here are from the coast? Almost everybody, yeah. And how many people are familiar with Fitzgerald Marine Reserve? Oh, that's great, and I don't have to worry about talking about this place. And how many of you are members of the History Association? Oh, that's great. For those of you who aren't, why aren't you? I mean, it's a great organization. You know what they say about history? If you're not interested in history, you might have been born yesterday. You really should look into it. I will say one other thing. I'm also a member of the History Association, but not a docent or anything like that. I just donate to them. Where I put most of my effort into on the coast has been a member of the Friends of Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. And I will say one thing that we've been doing very recently. We've been collaborating with the History Association and actually doing tours of the Seal Cove area, talking about the history, the indigenous history, how the indigenous people use the plants. We've been doing that mainly for senior communities. Actually, we did one about 2 years ago for the Coastside seniors. So we do them for like Saratoga Retirement Community, we do one for the B, we've done them for a variety of different senior communities. So you might be interested in that. One of your members, I'm sure she's here, Vicki in the back, Vicki Mitchell. She collaborates with us on those tours. Let's get right into this. When I first was asked to do this speech, I was asked to do a history of the Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. And I quickly realized that the history of the Marine Reserve is in common with, at least in the beginning, the indigenous people, the Spanish, Mexican. It's in common with the whole area. And I thought, my goodness, these people have already heard this story. And sure enough, I went into the archives of the History Association. I found Dave Cresson had talked extensively about the indigenous people, the Spanish and Mexican, and even some of the United States stuff. And certainly Mark Hilkema had too. I went back and I listened to several of those presentations. So I'm not going to talk too much about either the indigenous era or the Spanish-Mexican era, because Dave and Mark have said it all. And if you're really interested in that, go back and look at the archives, because you can get all that information. When I look at this, I look at it as eras. I look at the first line there as the indigenous era. And you notice how long it is. It's literally thousands of years. Then you look at the next line. Spain. How long? Roughly 50 years? Then you look at the Mexican, which are sort of combined. And it's what, 25 years? Think of the change that occurred to the indigenous people in one generation. Amazing. Really amazing. I will say one thing about the Spanish. One thing I was amazed about in looking at the history of the missionization, which was much, much different The colonization out here was totally different than colonization on the East Coast. One of the things that happened up here, particularly up here, really reflects what was going on in Spain at that time. There was a lot of change in Spain. The Spanish Empire was on its way down. They had a lot of change in the early 1700s. The Habsburg ruler died without an heir, and there was a war of succession. And, Spain was then taken over by the Bourbons, which was mainly French. Very different in outlook, very less local government control, more centralized. One other thing they did that was really, really interesting was in 1767, they tossed the Jesuits out from the mission and put in the Franciscans. That's why you had the Empress Sarah involved. A big change in just the way that these people looked at the missionization. And when you think about missionization, I always thought the missionization was sort of a haphazard thing. It really was not. There were lots of laws that spelled out exactly how the colonization was supposed to happen. I mean, down to the minute details. And how the military establishments were done, how the missions were supposed to be put up, and how ultimately the pueblos, the towns were supposed to be put up. The scheme originally was, and when you think about colonization, you have to think about one thing. It's very people-oriented. You have to have people in order to colonize. That was a real problem for the Spanish. They didn't have a lot of people. Unlike the East Coast, where you had loads of immigrants coming in from Europe. That wasn't happening out here. So you're trying to form an empire without people. Very difficult. So they pretty much failed in the missionization. They failed by their own standards. I think most people, if I asked in this crowd, and I will ask the question, who owned the land when the Spanish were here? Who owned this land? Most people say the church. Not totally technically correct under the law. The church held the land in trust with the native peoples. The scheme was always to make the native peoples into Spanish citizens, to make them into Catholics and Spanish citizens, then turn the land over. And originally they thought they could do that in 10 years. Well, they didn't do it, for a variety of reasons. So they failed miserably. Which brings us to the Mexican situation. Now everybody knows that the Mexicans took over, and that was again a reflection of a lot of the changes that were occurring. And you had a lot of social strata set up where Spanish were on top, and then maybe the people who had some Spanish and native mixture, and then the Indios right down at the bottom. So it was a big social structure that was set up, and that was really irking a lot of the people, a lot of the people who had been born out here. So there was a lot of turmoil there. There was also a lot of turmoil in this, after the Mexican Revolution, the Mexican government was in total turmoil. A lot of their resources had been wiped out. A lot of the mines down there that were the source of their wealth had been totally flooded, irreparably flooded. They were changing presidents almost weekly. As an example, Santa Anna held the presidency on 11 different times during this about 12-year period. So the whole thing was in turmoil. The other thing that you have to realize that in New Spain, we were sitting in Siberia, the Siberia of New Spain. This was the end of the world for them. There wasn't a heck of a lot of interest. Remember, Cabrillo comes up in maybe 1540, comes to this neck of the woods, doesn't find the 7 cities of gold, doesn't find the Northwest Passage, turns around and goes back. It's 200 years for the Portola expedition. 200 years. They didn't care about this place. In Dave Crescen's speech, he did a marvelous job of laying out the population. There were not many people here. There really weren't many people. I remember you were tallying up the number of people, and it kept going down, of course, as the native population diminished from disease and from mistreatment. But there just weren't a lot of people here at all. So this was sort of the end of the earth, which meant there wasn't a lot of good communication, there wasn't a lot of good resources coming up there. Everybody here had to be self-sufficient. So that's sort of what happens in there. And then we come to the last one, which is 1848. That's, of course, when at the end of the Mexican-American War. So here's the Seal Cove history. This is where it starts to get interesting. We've already had the land grants happen, which Dave and Sully talked extensively about in his presentations. This area was owned originally by Francisco Guerrero. He actually he was Mexican. He came up from Mexico in 1834 with the Hias Padres colony. That colony was set up as a colony. There were about 150 people that Mexico sent up here to basically help colonize and to be a buffer against what they perceived to be a threat to their sovereignty, Russia. You know, you had Fort Ross 80 miles north of here, and the Russians had big, big plans. They had plans to claim all the way from the north of San Francisco Bay all the way up to the American coast. It didn't happen. But there were certainly plans for that. So he comes up here, he gets a land grant. And the land grants, again, weren't really haphazard. They were really set out in the law quite rigorously. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the native peoples could also get land grants. Now, that didn't happen around this area because most of the native people were gone. But it did happen in other areas of the Bay Area. Olampali, up in Marin County, land grant to a native person. Where Moffett Field is now, it's land granted to a native. Along the Guadalupe River, where San Jose is now, also granted to native people. So native people were high on the list, because remember, they wanted to give the land back. That's what secularization was all about. It was giving the land back and putting it in private hands. So, Francisco Guerrero is here. He comes up here. By the way, the colony, the Hijas Padres colony, failed miserably. They didn't have the resources. There was bad communication, all the turmoil down in Mexico in the government. It just didn't work out. So they spread out. He shows up in San Francisco. He ultimately becomes, on 2 occasions, the mayor of Yerba Buena, which is now San Francisco. In 1841, he marries Josefa de Haro. Her father, Francisco de Haro, was the first mayor of Yerba Buena, or San Francisco. He came up from Mexico in 1819. So he was here really before the end of the Mexican War for Independence. Josefa de Haro was 16 at the time. She's a gorgeous woman. The accounts of her was a spectacular young woman. They have sons. They had 2 sons who play a role in this area. She's married until 1851, when her husband dies. Actually, he was killed. Dave also went into that. We talked about him being killed because he was a specialist in land grants and was testifying in favor of some of the non-Americans, and the Americans, they could wipe him out for doing that. So he gets killed, and 2 years later, she marries James Gamble Tennyson. Now, Dennison came out here originally as a soldier with the 1st Regiment of the New York Volunteers. He came out to fight in the Mexican-American War. So he comes into this area. I think he got here in 1846, maybe, 46, 47. I don't know whether he fought in anything. I think he was primarily stationed here. Because most of the fighting in California was down south. Monterey gave up pretty quickly from when the Navy came there. So he's a former soldier. He tried his hand, I guess, in the gold rush, of course, for shortly after this. He tried his hand in that, and came back to San Francisco, and then really struck gold when he, of course, married Josepha, because she had inherited this area. So what we call the Corral de Tierra, at least the northern part, roughly from Montara Mountain to Medio Creek, and from the ocean up to Skyline. That's a nice piece of property. Her father, as I mentioned, also was a big landholder. He held what was called the Rancho de Laguna Merced. And guess what that is? It's the area around the Merced. So they came from really the hierarchy of San Francisco. When Francisco and Josepha owned the property, they were sort of absentee landlords. They really weren't down here very much. They were up in San Francisco. That sort of changed when Dennison came down. And it changed because right at the end there, when the start of the Mexican-American War was going on, they moved down here from San Francisco because it was a lot safer. And that's when they actually built the building there. So James Dennison gets, I have a word up there. Does anybody know what coverture is? You don't? When the United States came in, California held a constitutional convention, I think it was 1851. And, of course, the law changed dramatically from Spanish-Mexican, and particularly in the marital laws area. Under Spanish law, single women and married women could own property separately. When the Americans took over, this became what we call a community property state, but there was this overlay of coverture, which was really sort of British law, which came in. What coverture says is that when you get married, the woman's identity is subsumed by the man. She loses most of her rights to property. So that's why James Dennison took the property over. Now we still have vestiges of coverture here. How many, most of you married ladies have your husband's last name, right? You gave up your name. That's what coverture was all about. Interesting. So during all this time, this area was used primarily for ranching and agriculture. And there's an 1865 map of this area, which says all of the area around the reserve was granaries, or grain, probably for the horses and cattle. Dennison was very successful. He was, I think, probably one of the richest, if not the richest person in Santiago County. He's a fairly young man. Unlike Francisco, who was quite a bit older than Josepha, he was only a couple of years older than Josepha. They had a daughter. He also, not only did they have a daughter, he had Bright's disease. Bright's disease is a kidney disease. And he's going to die from it in 1869. But 2 years before he died, probably in anticipation of, because he was probably ill from Bright's disease. He transfers the property back to Josepha and her 2 sons. And this is a map. You see you have to pay at this point. This, it was split in 4. There was a little part up here, this little thing here went to Josepha, and this property down here, this is the Deal Creek, this property down here went to Josepha. This one went to Augustine, 1 son, and this went to Victoriano. This is right where Fitzgerald is, right around here. So Victoriano was the one who felt where did this property. So Victoriano was also pretty much an absentee landlord. It continues to be used, the land continues to be used for ranching and agriculture. Then we get to 1879. Some really big things happened of historical significance to the reserve in 1879. Anybody have a guess what the very first one was? Rome. Anybody know what this map is? The Half-Moon Bay Colma Road was built. Yeah, the first road going over the hill to San Francisco. It's this green line here. This is Montara Beach. And the rest of the road is down here. But this green line is the Half-Moon Bay Colma Road. What a road, huh? You remember, this is 1879, so it's before, any automobiles, right? So it's really built for horses and wagons. It really gets zigzaggy, but you got to remember it's going up a mountain. So whenever you're doing that, you're probably doing, switchbacks all over the place, and you're trying to ford over all the, there's several creeks along here. It's really important because it really sort of changed the outlook on how this land was going to be used. By the way, this red line here is the old Coastside Boulevard, and it took over in 1915 in place of the original Half-Moon Bay Colma Road. And this was the one that was really built for automobiles. By 1915, there were automobiles. It also made a big change. Colma Road really opened the place up. And many people thought, wow, this is really an opportunity to make a little bit of money. So the second thing that happens is that the Half-Moon Bay Colony Company is formed, specifically for the purpose of purchasing a big hunk of Victoriano's land. And so in 1879, the same year the Colma Half-Moon Bay Road is opened, they buy this land for the purpose of subdividing it for homesteads. Drastic change in land use. So, just so you, this map is a little bit blurry. It shows really parsons. This is the Point Montara Lighthouse. So what we're talking about here, when we're talking about Seal Cove, is this little area right down here. That's the Seal Cove. This, of course, this is the land that was owned by Augustine. So this is the property, of course, Winky buys. Everybody knows who Winky is. Don't everybody know who Winky is? The Winky Hotel? original hotel in Montara, or Moss Beach. Jurgen Winke came over here from Germany. He saw the ad, these guys put ads in all the papers for this. They were selling it, I think it was it between 10 and 50 bucks an acre, depending on where it was. Pretty cheap. Pretty cheap. This was formed, their headquarters were on Montgomery Street, the Half Moon Bay Colony Company. This was, they weren't local at all. This was just land development. So anyway, the Half Moon Bay Colony Company, Jurgen Winke buys in 1881. And guess who else sees his ad? An immigrant from Ireland who immigrated over here in 1879, he and his wife. So those are the three things that happened. The road, Half Moon Bay Colony, we're subdividing land, and then George Sidney Smith III and Susan Porter Moore Smith, couple that buys that Seal Cove property from the Half Moon Bay Colony Company. I spent a fair amount of time researching the Smith family, and this is what I'm going to talk about, primarily about them and what they did mostly. Because when I approached this, I wanted to talk really about things that weren't really found in the books, in the history books, and hadn't been talked about in the archives of this organization. Now, I've written articles about this for the Friends of Fitzgerald newsletter, several articles, matter of fact. George Sidney Smith was born in Ireland, in Dublin. He wasn't Irish, because Ireland was part of Britain then. And his father, George Sidney Smith II, was a professor of Greek at Trinity College in Dublin, and also an Anglican minister. They were not Catholic, they were Anglican. George goes to medical school over in Ireland and graduates, I think, in about 1963 from Trinity College. It's an interesting story. I'll talk a little bit about his wife. Susan Porter Moore Smith was born in Clinton, British Columbia. So she had come over years before, but when she got to the point of having to go to school, they sent her back to school. There probably wasn't a lot of advanced schooling in British Columbia at that time. They sent her back. That's where she met George back in Ireland. They got married. They had three sons. So George and Susan immigrated over here from Ireland. I ultimately got in touch with some of the family members. Actually, he got in touch with me. Because as I said, I'd written an article about this in our newsletter. And about 2 years after I had written the article, the rangers at the ranger station at Fitzgerald got a call from this guy, and he wanted to talk to me. So they took down his contact information. I called him. He was back in Troy, Michigan. And I called him. It was the great-grandson of George C. Smith III. And he saw my article. And he had a lot of information about his family. He and I shared. We spent about 2 hours on the phone talking to each other. We were swapping emails and stuff. It was really pretty fascinating. He sent me a family tree that he had put together, the whole family. Really interesting. His family was George City. What was happening in Ireland at that time, there were a variety of things. The family thought that he was a minister. I don't think he was, but the family did think he was a minister. And there was a lot of interesting things going on. He was Anglican, and there was a lot of Protestant Catholic tension in Ireland at the time. And the Anglican Church, believe it or not, in Ireland was the established Church of Ireland because the monarch was Anglican, even though 90% of Ireland was Catholic. And because it was an established church, it was subsidized by the British government and the Crown. There was so much turmoil in Ireland about that they had to disestablish the church in the late 1860s, which meant that all the ministers lost their subsidy and lost their jobs, all the Anglican ministers. That's why they thought he came over. I think he came over for a variety of reasons. I think there were a lot of things going in Ireland. It was still suffering from, the potato famine and all that stuff. I think the economy was really down. George's sister had originally, George's sister was really fascinating. One of the things that the grandson shared with me was an article, actually a biography of George's sister, who was named Ciotti Lees Smith. And as a young woman in Ireland, she had become quite famous as a writer of hymns. And he sent me a biography of her that was written in a document called Hymnology Archive, which is published by the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. And he sent me a copy of his biography, and I got in touch with the archivist back there. I'm not that religious, and it was sort of fun talking to him, as a matter of fact. He had some things in the article which really was religious. But anyway, George's sister was really quite a lady. As I said, she became famous for writing hymns. She married a British sea captain from a very wealthy family. Was married for about 10 years. She and her husband actually came over to the United States in 1877 to Virginia. They came over to Virginia. He got sick. They went back. He died. Left her sea captain, of course, gives you a boatload of money. So she was very, very wealthy. Very, very wealthy. She's back in Ireland, and she marries a friend who had just lost his wife. And unfortunately, that friend had a lot of mental problems, and the marriage didn't work out. She got a divorce through the 1880s. And then she comes over back to the United States. She comes out here. By the way, George Lee Smith did not originally settle in Falls Beach. The family settled over in Oakland. That was their headquarters. And he had a medical practice. He actually went to the University of California med school when he first got out here. And I think he did it really to get certified, because I think you had to get certified in those days to practice. And it wasn't really formal, and I think probably the only place he could get certified was over at UC at the med school there. But anyway, the med school has his records, and they say he's an alumni of the place. But anyway, he had a medical practice I think on Steiner Street in San Francisco. And I don't know exactly when he purchased the Seal Cove property, but I think it was in the mid-1880s. Sometime between when he came over there in 1887, because they built a house in 1887. Getting back to Ciotti Lee Smith, his sister, when she comes over here to stay with her brother, she gets interested in prison ministry and starts hanging out at San Quentin prison, doing reform convicts. She was so interested in that, she got a lot of money. She buys a piece of property in Oakland, which sets up a boarding house for ex-cons. And she proceeds, of course, to fall in love with him. And she wants to marry him. And she ultimately does convince him to marry her. Part of the incentive was that she was going to buy him a ranch in Moss Beach. The real interesting thing about this is that she is 50 at the time this happened. He is 25. I've often wondered if she wasn't the incentive for the Half Moon Bay choosing their mascot. Cougar. So she was quite a lady. Obviously, that marriage made all the papers because it was pretty odd. And of course, it didn't last. He actually had his problem. He had tried to kill a policeman in Wisconsin and fled Wisconsin, and then came out here and he committed fraud, and that's why he was so he wasn't a very savory character, and the marriage really didn't last. They did hang out though at George's house down in Seal Cove. Anyway, George builds the house in 1887. And one of the things I was really curious about was what was his house? What did it look like? And fortunately, George's brother's grandson would be, I guess, the grandnephew of George, had written an article. His grandnephew had come to Fitzgerald Reserve and talked to Bob Green. Everybody know who Bob Green is? He was the ranger at the reserve for many years. Talked to Bob Green, and he convinced him to write an article for our newsletter. And in 1996, he did. And he was in his mid-80s at the time, and so he wrote this article. And in the article, he gave the editor of our newsletter quite a few photos of the area. And this is a picture of a family. This is, of course, George Sidney Smith and his wife. This is his brother Thomas. That's Charity there. This is George Sidney Smith IV, and then these three boys here were Thomas's sons. I don't know who the dog is. I couldn't find out anything about the dog. This is just to orient you so you know where we're talking about. The house was really built right about here. This is the bluff trail that comes along. This is where these trails meet. And there's still the foundations back in there. And I think at least some of the foundations, probably the brick is from the original house. This is one of the photos that Arthur, the grandnephew. When I first saw this, I thought, it doesn't sound like the house that it was described because it was called a big red house. That does not look like a big red house. And indeed, this is not. This is what the grandnephew referred to as the cottage house. So it was a second place built after the big red house. It was the original house. And this was built primarily as a guest cottage. So I still didn't know. And I'm trying to figure it out. So he also sent this photo. And this shows a corner of the house. I figured that's the big red house. And this is the side of the cottage house. So this was the only partial picture that we had of that house. And then in rummaging through, and I had all of June Morell's book. Everybody know who June Morell is? Very famous historian thereabouts. This is a photo from her book on Wall Speech, the one that came out posthumously. This is the northwest corner of the big red house, right here. So I had the southeast corner and the northwest corner. That's all I had. And then, about a month after I had talked with Craig Smith, the great-grandson, a guy shows up at the reserve and tells the rangers that his grandfather and father had stayed with the Smiths in 1912 for 5 months. And the Rangers, knowing that I was really interested in all this, get his contact information and gives it to me. He's left by that time. He actually lived down in Birmingham, Alabama. He was a retired professor emeritus at a university of music down there. I called him, and he said, he told me his grandfather and his father had stayed there. And he said, everything I know about Seal Cove is in a chapter about my family history, his family history, that his father wrote. This is a chapter in there called Seal Cove Days. And I, of course, the antennas went up. And I said, any chance you could send me a copy? He said, sure. Better yet, I'll send you a copy of the book. And I got the book. And the chapter is about a dozen pages long. And on the third page is the full front picture, which of course was on the flyer. This is the big red house. It's the only known photo that I know of anywhere. You know, it has the widow's walk up on top. The great-grandson also sent me a letter that had been written by grandnephew's sister, Marion, her name was. And she described staying there probably around 1920. And she describes the house and living there for a while. And the house, according to her description, had 11 rooms, and it had 2 separate apartments. And the reason it had 2 separate apartments is because the Smiths had a cook maid named Martha and a chauffeur, handyman, named Martin. And they lived with the Smiths. I also learned from that book that indeed, and I had suspected it, this was a summer home. This was a summer home for the Smiths. This was not their primary residence. Until, I think, like most people, I followed the same thing. I had a home over on the other side, and I had a home over here. I used to come over here occasionally, and as I got older, I came over here a lot more. And that's exactly what the Smiths did. They started hanging out more and more with me. So that's the big red house. High ceilings. The chapter in the book describes life there. The Smiths were very, very formal. George Sidney Smith III dressed in a tuxedo for dinner. His wife dressed in very high collar, like, Queen of England. The maid, they had a little sort of bell thing for the maid. They had a big, this was probably 1920, she said they had a big black Pierce Arrow automobile, which they would, on Sundays they would pack all the kids in and take them into town to church, probably at the, what was it, the Methodist Episcopalian Church? Is that right, Dave? They're the Methodist Episcopalian Church in town? Yeah. I've often wondered to get in touch with, it's the one I think on Johnson, the beautiful one. I've often wondered if the records in that church might have the records of the Smith family.
Interesting question.
Something to look into. Anyway, that's the big red house. And so those are the houses. The other thing that would intrigue me, actually answered one of my questions. What intrigued me was the trees. I often wondered where the iconic Monterey cypress trees. We all knew that when the indigenous people were there were no trees except for the trees, the arroyo willow trees along San Vicente Creek. No other trees. So who planted the trees? If you read the history books, Winkie planted the trees. So I asked you a question. Why would Winkie plant trees on property he did not own? I suspected that the Smiths planted the trees, at least the original big trees, on the perimeter, because they're on the perimeter of the property. And actually, Bob Breen, when Arthur Smith, the grandnephew, came to town. Bob actually had a little article about that in our newsletter, which indeed said that Arthur told him that the Smith family planted the trees along the perimeter. So Jurgen, we did not plant the trees at Seal Cove. The Smiths planted them. At least the ones on the perimeter. So that was, this, we also had a 1928 aerial views. I got these in connection with the 50th anniversary of the reserve. And although you can't see it very well, there's trees along the perimeter. It doesn't show up very well. But you can clearly see the trees along the perimeter. I looked very, very hard for the palm trees, because they're also a kind of thing at the reserve. And I was very puzzled about who would plant it. Bob Breeden told me that the Smiths had, one of the Smiths' relatives and brother, he said, was a sea captain, who had given the trees. These are canary palm trees from the Canary Islands. Of course, I looked at all of his siblings, and none of them were sea captains. So I sort of knew that. The other thing is, the trees were planted right in front of where the house was. You see these palm trees? No. I don't think the palm trees were planted by the Smiths. They were planted by the subsequent owner, one of the subsequent owners. I believe anyway, Henry Dolger. And I looked at all the possibilities. I looked at the Spanish, I looked at the Mexicans, I looked at the Smiths, I looked at Henry Dolger, I believe he planted. Now, there's another iconic tree in the reserve. That's a big sweet chestnut tree just to the east. It's a beautiful tree. It's a European chestnut tree. Who would have had familiar, and they're fairly rare around here. You know, European chestnuts did not come into California until the mid-1800s. So that rules out the Spanish, and rules out the Mexicans. And Smiths, probably. You know, they grew up in Ireland. Loads of sweet chestnut trees. Part of the cuisine, part of the, roasting chestnuts over a fire and all that stuff. Yeah. So I believe that they planted that sweet chestnut. So, this is the other part that I want to talk about. It has nothing to do with the Smiths. Well, let me talk about it a little bit. Henry Dolger, when George and Susan Portermore Smith die, they leave their property to their son Harry. Harry continues to use it, although, according to Arthur, the grandnephew, he lets it go downhill and he ultimately sells it. Now, I know from the stuff that I'm going to tell you about shortly that he owned it at least through World War II. And I know that Henry Dolger bought it. So I think Henry Dolger bought it around maybe 1947. And then he tore down the houses. Henry Dolger tore down the houses and built a ranch-style house. If anybody knows of anybody that might have a picture of that ranch house, I'd like to see it. And I've asked a lot of people. I don't know the different existing pictures of that. It burned down in 1970. Or what was left of it burned down in 1970. Anyway, Henry Dolger owns it. Of course, he was going to develop the Coastside into a mini Daly City, which didn't work because there was too much opposition by all of you people to that. And he gave up. He, of course, had a yacht over in the Mediterranean, and that's what he did to console himself for not being able to build this yacht. And he, of course, dies over there. And he leaves his money to his wife, Thelma, who is also quite a character. Does everybody thinks of Henry Dolger as a big land developer. Does anybody know where he really got his money? He and his wife were in partnership. They were bootleggers. They got their stuff down here, as a matter of fact. They sold it to all the bars and there's some really fabulous stories about them dealing up there, almost getting caught by the feds. Yeah. They used to come down here to get their, and then they invested all that money into real estate. And that's great. And the reason I believe he built the palm trees is because if you go over to Westlake Shopping Center, which he was building in the late 1840s, you'll see that there are a lot of palm trees. And as a matter of fact, I did a lot of research and I found some litigation involving the Westlake Homeowners Association. There's actually provisions in the Homeowners Association regs to provide for upkeep of all of the palm trees that he planted in the homes that he built. So he was fascinated by mid-century modern stuff. He put almost probably on that. So now we get to the point where I want to talk about entire video. And the way this came about is that we're in the process of redoing the inside of the visitor center. And the county built this interpretive panel, and it's a timeline, a history timeline of the uses of the land. And one of the items that was on this timeline was dated 1942, and it was a photo of 4 members of the Women's Air Force Service pilots with a plane, a bomber in the background. And when I saw that, and I had heard all the stories, whenever we take people up on the Bluff Trail, you look out at the what we call a monument that sits off at the Distillery Point there. It's a remnant from World War II, and we tell people that's from World War II, and then we tell the story about, the WASP, the Women's Air Force Service pilots, flew planes, towed targets behind it, for artillery practice. That's what we tell them. When I looked at that, I thought, I wonder if those 4 women really served here or not. And I thought, also, I don't know anything, I really didn't know anything about the WASP other than their name and sort of what they did, what they did. So, of course, I started to do a deep dive into that. And one of the first things that I did is I found out that there's a official archive of the WASPs down at the Texas Women's University in Denton, Texas, which is down in Fort Worth, Dallas area. I got in touch with the archivist there, and I told her that I wanted to know who the WASPs were that were here and stuff about them. She sent me a huge amount of material. So I started to do all this research on the WASPs. So, I thought it was amazing. Does anybody know much about the WASPs? There weren't many women. I didn't think there were that many women who were pilots before World War II. And there weren't very many. Most of the women that were wealthy women. They were not employable by the commercial airlines. Very interestingly, several of them were actually demonstration pilots for airplane manufacturers. And they would demo flying the planes for potential customers. And the reason they'd love to have women do that, line was, well, see, if a woman can fly this plane, you certainly can. So, World War II, a lot of people in the 30s saw World War II coming. And they actually started up a civilian pilot training program in anticipation of that. And of course, we had a lot of gender discrimination back in those days. But believe it or not, for every 10 candidates, they would allow one woman. For every 10, the trainees that were having. So that was sort of the World War II comes along. There are 2 women who were really, really very famous pilots. One of them was called Nancy Love, and the other was Jackie Cochran. And Jackie Cochran particularly they had flown in air races and aerobatics and won all kinds of awards and everything. They were fabulous pilots. And they wanted to help in the war effort. Nancy said, I'll start up a group to ferry planes from the United States over to Great Britain. So she put a small group of women pilots over to do that. Jackie Cochran said, well, what we really ought to do is start a training thing for women pilots who can actually pilot military aircraft. Jackie Cochran was totally politically plugged in. She and her husband were personal friends of the Roosevelts. They knew all the generals, they knew all the politicians in Washington. So Jackie, with Eleanor Roosevelt's help, by the way, finally got the Army Air Force to do an experiment. The experiment was that they were going to form this training corps for women pilots. And it was experimental in that they wanted to find out what women could really do in terms of piloting military aircraft. And they also wanted to see whether they could free up some of the male pilots, because male pilots were at a premium then, for combat duty. So the idea was that the women pilots would take over all the domestic things like ferrying planes from the manufacturer to the fields, flying staff around, doing some other stuff. So they did that. And they started, the first WASPs were actually trained on, well, when they put the word out, over a two-year period, and they put the word out that they wanted women pilots. How many women pilots, how many women, and the requirements were really interesting. First it was, you had to be 20 years old, between 20 and 35. You had to have a high school education. You had to have 200 hours. You had to have a pilot's license, 200 hours. So they, for a 2-year period, they were soliciting women for this. How many women do you think applied? 25,000. I was amazed. They picked 1,800 out of the 25,000. And the first flight training started to occur down in Texas. Originally in a field down in Houston, but they didn't have good facilities for the females. And the weather down there wasn't good, so there's a lot of fog coming in. So they ultimately moved it up to an airfield called Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, which is over the Panhandle. When the women started coming in, it created a real serious problem. Number one, they weren't really militarized at that time. They were considered to be volunteers. They were civilian volunteers. They weren't militarized. They never were until 1977. But anyway, when the women started showing up the physicals, of course, all these Army Air Force MDs had never had to give women a physical examination for flight training. That created a problem. The other problem was that they really wanted to protect women's reputations. You know, everybody was a lot of concern about who are these women, you know, were they looking for men to marry, you know, were they prostitutes, you know, all kinds of crazy things. So they wanted to protect the women's reputation. So they decided, well, who's going to train them? We're going to have men train them. And that might be a problem because we didn't want to have any fraternization. So they said, this is classic male thinking. They said, what we'll do is we'll only have married men teaching, because married men know how to handle women. You guys all agree with that? Just Nazi stuff. So anyway, they started training up at Sweetwater. There were several male training bases fairly close to that. As soon as the male trainees realized there were a bunch of female trainees at Avenger Field at Sweetwater, they of course start flying over and landing. Command says, we can't have that. This is too disruptive. So total ban. No more flyovers, no more landings. Total ban. In the first 2 weeks after the ban, there were 135 emergency landings. Yeah. So anyway, my goal was to find out who these women were and how many of them were. Anybody want to take a guess at how many of them served at it was called the Half Bay Flight Strip, by the way. It was built, you know where the flight strip is, now the Half Bay Airport. Anybody know have a guess how many? I was amazed. 3. 3. Remember, there were only 1,800 of them. So I found, I said that this archivist sent me a whole bunch of stuff. This is part of a huge table. It listed there were several hundred airfields where the WASP trained. You can see here, this is a Half Bay Flight Strip location. This describes what they did. This is what their mission was. This is when they served. They only served for 4 to 5 months. 3. This is the number. 3. I found out other articles about who the 3 were and how they were trained. And I often wondered about the target, what they really did here. And then everybody, and even one of them came back into this area and was actually interviewed by June Morrell. And she was also interviewed by Gables, who's standing in the back there. And her name was Shirley Ingalls, who married Montara. And she told both June Morrell and David she took targets. But you see what this says. And there were a lot of other documents that said the same thing. I'll talk about a little bit about that. Did any of you attend Mr. Olswein's talk? He talked about 10 years ago to this group about what happened. That was fabulous. I went back and listened to that. He mentioned a little bit about the loss, but he didn't give a lot of detail. But you remember, Harper, that he talked about radio controlling. But there was a lot of radio control drones there. Yeah. These 3 WASPs were part of the class designated 43-3, which was the 3rd class in 1943. And as I said, they did their original training in Sweetwater. When they finished their training, they were being sent to a variety of things, but that got stalled. They took 29 of the members of that class. It started a class with 58 to start with, and they washed 20 of them out. So there were 38 to pass the class. They took 29 of those and sent them back to Washington to meet with Jackie Cochran, she was the founder of the group, and the general of the Army Air Force, the name of Hap Arnold. And the group of 29 that group of 29 met with Jackie Cochran and Hap Arnold, and were told that they were selected to do some very high-level, top-secret training. It was called tow target. And tow target training consisted of 2 different classes. One of them was where they actually really did tow a tethered flag, if you will, on a line. They would drop it out the back of the plane and tow it in different patterns. That was the first type of tow target. The second type of tow target, which was really very highly top secret, was 2 of them would fly in a mothership, which was usually a small Cessna, 2-seater. One would fly it. The other would radio control a target drone. So there was no tether. They were radio controlled. much more complicated technology than simply tossing something out the back of a plane. So that was the two things. Both of them were called tow target. So after the training, and that original training took place back in Georgia, the group was sent for an additional training to another facility for another 3 months. And then they were sent, the 3 ladies that were sent, that ultimately wound up here, were actually sent up to Falmouth, Massachusetts, to actually do some tow target. And they actually talked about, Shirley actually, one of them wrote an article about being shot at that time in the tow target. They were actually doing radio control stuff. They were doing other things too. You know, they did a whole variety of things. They did some ferrying, and I think they also did the searchlight, you know, fly planes at night for searchlight training and stuff like that. But the tow target training was really dangerous because they were towing things that were being shot at by a bunch of dumb men who you know, thought it was great fun to take a shot at the planes. So it's fairly dangerous. So these are the 3 ladies. This is Mildred Chapman. Actually, that's spelling her. Her name is really Chapin, C-H-A-P-I-N. That's her married. Mildred Chapin is her married name because her maiden name was Mildred Toner. She was 22 when she joined the WASPs. She was from Colorado. The middle lady, Mary Lee Weatherby, she was 32. She's 10 years older. She had been married in the mid-1930s to her brother. Actually, her brother was a theater producer and director. And she married a colleague of her brother's who was also a theater, he's British. He was also a theater producer and director, and they lived in London. He died 2 years after they were married. She moved back. As a young girl, she was born in Louisiana, northern Louisiana, and her father died at a very young age, and her mother remarried to an Army Air Force colonel. So nowhere she figured out that he decided to fly. But anyway, she's 10 years older. Shirley, that's her married name. Her maiden name was Ingalls, Shirley Ingalls. She's the one who came here and talked to Jim Morrell and Dave. And she talked to Dave when she was in her 90s. She was just in her 90s because I think she lived to be 96. And she talked to Jim Morrell about 10 years before that. She was a little bit older. She was, I think, 24. The average age, by the way, of these was about 24. Probably very few older ones. Mary probably served as sort of a big sister for these two, I would guess. Yeah. Mary never married after her husband passed away. She was a really interesting lady. She went on, after the loss, she went to New York and got a job with Life magazine, and ultimately was the travel editor. And she actually died in about 60 on an assignment as an editor. She and some of her colleagues were up in British Columbia on the Campbell River doing whitewater canoeing, and we tipped over and she had a very, I don't know too much about what Mildred did. She married a gentleman who I think lived in the Nashville area, and I think lived there. She also passed away at a very young age. She passed away when she was 51. Shirley was really interesting. before the war, Shirley had worked for Steuben Glass in New York, where she was born in New York. She worked for Steuben Glass. After the war, she did a little bit more flying, but not much, and then went back to work for Steuben Glass, and she got married. And she and her husband ultimately moved to San Francisco. And she lived in San Francisco for a while, and then when they decided to retire, and that was in 1993, they retired to the Carmel Valley Manor down in Carmel Valley. And it just so happens that my wife and I have applied for residency down there. So I actually got in touch with, she died in 2015, and I got in touch with them to see if anybody knew Shirley, and they said yes, but they really didn't have much information. So anyway, those were the three ladies. None of this you'll find in any of the history book. These are the planes that they controlled. So this was the Cessna type, and one of them would fly it, and the other would radio control. This plane was also capable of being manually flown, and during training they would often have a third wasp fly one of these in case the radio control went goofy and they didn't lose the plane. This plane is really, really high. You notice it was painted red for a reason. It was target. Everybody loved flying it. This was apparently a really maneuverable plane. They flew other planes too. When they actually were towing targets, they flew a different plane, which was like a little bomber. And they flew different planes for these searchlight training. But these are the ones that they flew radio control. Now, as I said, Shirley told both June and Dave that she towed targets. And she clearly could have really towed a target on a tether. But I know that they did this radio control stuff. And they happened to be flight. So one other thing I wanted to talk about, this is the end of it. I found these I was wondering where they lived. This is the runway. And then this was the adjacent stuff that they had. The men were down here. This is where they lived. This is a parcel map of the area. All of these numbered parcels here. I sort of figured they lived about halfway down Flight Strip. I figured they lived right here. And Shirley, I think when she was interviewed by June Morrell, said that they lived in an old farmhouse. It had really dark wood walls. And it turns out there's a table that goes along with this that identifies who owned all of this land. Was eminent domain taken over by the government. And this, who the owners were, and of course, some of this property, I think the one that they probably actually built in the farmhouse came from a name will be familiar to many of you, Giovanni Petroni, Joe Petroni, who of course was quite famous in the second woods. He had a restaurant in Princeton. He's reputedly a member of the local mafia. The other thing that's really, so they lived right here. There's a wonderful picture of Mary Leatherby in the fields out here that I didn't show it, but there's a wonderful picture of her. She's not in her uniform at all. She's dressed in cities. She's out in the field, so you can really tell it's where it is. A little bit more about the Wasp, how the Wasp ended. They disbanded them. They never militarized them. They disbanded them in 1940. 19 the end of 1944 and December of 1944. We just expanded them. And because they were never militarized, they had to find their own way home, pay for their own way home. They never got any benefits. Any VA benefits. Several of them were died during the other WASP would take up collections for burial purposes. They weren't treated very sad. I'm going to end with one thing. This is the Half Bay colony, which is where Seal Cove is. And there are parcel numbers in here. And many of these parcels that are listed there's a table that lists, again, all the owners, are Smiths from George's heirs. And one of them was, I think her name was Agnes. She actually lived in Montara. She died in Montara, maybe about 15 years ago. Several of the parcels were owned by an entity called the Don C. Company. I tried to find out who the heck they were. I couldn't. So there's anybody who would like to collaborate with me and who really likes going over to Redwood City to look at the records, which I hate. I'd be more than happy to collaborate with them to find out who owned it. So, there you go.
Before we have a question and answer, I just want to, again, thank Tom, because I think we had a really intimate history of the region we lived in, a lot of detail that you probably wouldn't find anywhere else. So these are the kind of things we like to be able to do in our presentations. And if you're not a member, we could really use your support. $25 to become a member, and all the proceeds go to keep programs like this happening, to keep the museum open on the weekends for visitors, whether they're local. We get visitors from all over the world to come to our jail and museum on the weekends, and it's totally privately funded. So the money, money's tight for everything, but we just really ask you, if you enjoyed this tonight and are not a member, to please consider doing so. And we have some time for questions. I checked with the library, we're a little over, but we're okay. So once again, before I turn it over for questions, I just want to thank Tom one more time.
Yes.
How far from the bricks that we see there now for the steps, was it to high tide in 1920? Because we know it keeps getting closer, and it has the entire coastside. I've always wondered that. If we walk by those steps,
What did you answer?
repeat the question.
Yeah, okay. He wants to know, relative to the bricks that you see alongside of the trail there, which is part of the foundation of the house, how far that was from sort of what the high tide line, right?
Yes.
Geologically, at the end of the last glacial maximum, which was about 11,700 years ago, that's when we started to get rising sea level. And that continued until about 5,000 years ago. And then it stabilized. So basically, the shoreline has been roughly the same for the last 5,000 years. It is now starting, because of global warming and increased sea rise, to come in again. But Fitzgerald Marine Reserve, at least geologically, as we know it, is about 5,000 years old. So in answer to your question, the bluff was still about the same level. There was actually a switchback trail that went down there. And the next time you walk down that trail, about halfway down the slope, if you look to the west, you'll see two concrete footings. And those were the footings of the railings, the initial railings. It's a switchback trail. Yeah. And you can still see a little bit. Most of it's in rotary way. By the way, the 1928 aerial photos showed about at least 30 feet of land west of the line of big trees that were there. Now it's almost at the trees. The trees are actually gone. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, there was a fellow in Moss Beach named R. Guy Smith. And R. Guy Smith was prominent in the founding of Moss Beach. He was the first postmaster. He had a photo business. He had an electrical business.
Not related.
Not related, that's my question.
Not related. He actually lived in the little house that's called Guadalupe
Guadalupe, yeah.
on California Street. And he, yeah, as a matter of fact, this is a sad story. My wife and I were thinking about purchasing one of the buildings on Carlos Street, in the industrial part of it. And I was trying to find out more information about it. And I knew that there had been, that Guy Smith had taken, he had a photographic processing. He processed Kodak film. He had taken a lot of photographs. And a lot of them had been, that's where June Morrell got a lot of photographs. So the people that owned the little framing shop, they were published. I went there and I asked them if they had any photographs of this property. And they told me a really sad story. You know, Guy Smith was a bachelor and he died without any heirs. And so some of his close family relatives, not close family relatives came in. We didn't know anything. There were boxes of photographs. They didn't know what to do with them. They couldn't do them. Very sad.
And once again, Tom, thank you so much for all the